Hello, friends. It's 10 a.m. in Redmond, and it's a day that starts with a T, so it's time for .NET API review, where we have a whole screen full of red. It's actually not true. We have a half screen full of red, um, but we need to get through a lot of them. Um, that's fun. So we'll just get started. I assume we're still skipping the quick things because some of the quick people can't be here.
I believe so. I think the plan was to do it next Tuesday.
Right. Just making sure since you were here, Tomas, that we weren't expecting something different. All right. So first up, non-cooperative abortion of code execution 69622. Um, Anybody want to talk about this one?
Yeah, it's fine. So there is a regression in usability for F# interactive. So previously, you could abort execution of some, like you write some submission, press enter, and if it takes too long, you could cancel it. But since thread abort was obsoleted and removed from .NET Core, it's no longer possible. So the idea of this proposal is to uh, like introduce it back, but only through some special API, which is we would not to want many programs to use this API because it's inherently dangerous. It can leave their runtime in inconsistent state. So one of the reasons why it happens because we removed some guarantees we had in desktop.NET framework, like log tracking and finally block execution. So now we can inline finally blocks. In this case, they won't be executed in case of thread abort exception. So there is some, it's a kind of dangerous API, but it really improves user experience. And Kevin Johnson tried my implementation, and he said it's really, it works really great. So should we go through the methods or like?
So I just don't understand, how does this actually work under the covers? Then the runtime just randomly terminates that execution thread?
It's a good question. So yes, well, it's not like calling Win32 terminate thread. Obviously, you can always like invoke to terminate thread, and right now there is no like protection mechanism from doing that. But if your thread inside of runtime, then your process won't be usable after that point. So we reuse the same functionality that was used previously for thread abort and still used by aborting function evaluation. So right now, if you write expression in the during debugging session, and if it takes too long, debugger has ability to terminate the thread, and there is a like user abort API for that. And this proposal just reuses that API and kind of make it public, not only through debugger API, but also through normal framework API. So what it does, it it sets the thread abort requested flag on the thread, and the thread checks this flag on doing any P invoke, memory allocations, and so on. So at some moment, it will notice that the flag is raised, and it will create a thread abort exception and throws it. And there is so if so originally in .NET framework, if thread abort exception is thrown, then code in finally blocks would still be executed. It's still the case now. However, we implemented some optimization to inline finally blocks, and if finally block is really small and inlined, right now it won't be executed. But if you catch thread abort exception, when at the end of catch block, it will be rethrown by the runtime. It's existing mechanism. I did not change that. So you cannot kind of suppress thread abort until we unwind to the this controlled execution dot run frame. So basically, it's using mechanism we already have for aborting function evaluation in the runtime.
So why is it in compiler services?
Also good question. So I don't have any strong opinion. So actually, F# Interactive, it's kind of code gen facility. So they generate the code. So it's kind of F# compiler. We do not want it to be in the main namespace, like system namespace, because we don't want like people to easily discover it and use it, because we are afraid that it might be abused by libraries, like some NuGet packages. So one of the concern and request to make it opt out was from the paint.net developer. So he said there is thousands of plugins for paint.net, and if some plugin starts like using this dangerous API, then it's hard to prevent it. So he said he already doing some like IL rewriting stuff on the fly to prevent some bad things from happening. So he asked if he can make this opt-out. Or another option is to make it opt-in. But like, so from my talk from F# Interactive guys, so they did not favor to make it opt-in because they like F# compiler is also shipped as a library, fsc.dll, and there are multiple tools using it, and so they like every tool would have to opt into this API to use it. So I'm free to change the namespace if you have better proposal.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the list, the only one that looks like a closer fit to me is constrained execution, but it's not what SIR was doing either. So
constrained execution is removed and not supported. So
yeah. So
and whatever we do, we want to put this somewhere where it screams "There be dragons," and I think we also should consider an analyzer that basically, turns this into a warning, so that people have to basically acknowledge the fact that they're doing something that's, potentially screwing up the entire process.
I mean, we can mark it as obsolete warning just out of the box.
We actually have precedent for stuff like that. So what was wrong with just the system runtime namespace? Because I don't recall that coming up previously. Because it looks like we already have things like memory fail points in there, and this kind of sort of matches that in my mind.
I'm fine with system runtime.
Like I understand compiler services as being like the thing that kind of hides it for most people, but it just really does seem like the wrong namespace. If we have an analyzer or obsolete it right out of the box, we could just say screw it, put it right in system threading.
System threading, I think too many things pull in.
Sure. It is also one of the default usings.
System runtime, at least, has very few things in it that most people care about.
I mean, we have used system runtime as the, I always want to say throwaway namespace for runtime internals that like 6 people in the world want to call. So
yeah, well, the only thing that I really see from it that people would use is like is GC settings. Like the rest of it seems like things that if you're not on this call, you've probably never seen and don't care about. So system runtime seems like a reasonable bag to me.
Stepping out of the window.
Yeah, sorry, I dropped off for a few minutes. Like, did we talk about cancellation token at all? Did anybody raise that?
No, so far we were just talking about the namespace.
Well, the cancellation token by definition is cooperative, is it not?
Yes.
Yes, but like it sounded like what Anton was saying is that there is some sort of internal, or like not internal, but there is some sort of flag that is set by the runtime that I guess the action is supposed to query. Did I get
No,
this
this
right?
is not. This isn't the user code isn't involved in it. This is like I invoke Emo's function that is totally unaware of me or anything that I have, and I get to shoot that code. And hopefully things don't go badly when I do.
I see.
I have some questions too about how this works. So if try abort returns false, does that mean an abort will not happen, or does it mean that like the code just hasn't stopped within the timeout?
The latter. So so once you set thread abort flag when thread start aborting, but because it can be stuck in native code, or it can like catch the exception and do some additional processing, it may not fit in this timeout. So it's a letter. So the like you cannot guarantee the state of the thread after you call try abort. It may
So
still be
based on
aborted,
that,
but just
like,
later.
My thinking would be is like, since if I call try abort, like and it doesn't throw, like it's going to abort. Like it might not abort by the time it finishes, but like that's certainly what's going on. Like, isn't it more like manual reset event slim.wait? Like, why is there a try there? Like, I am aborting. The bool just tells you whether it happened before it finished or not. And as far as the cancellation token being cooperative, like, okay, yeah, the actual running code doesn't cooperate with it, but it seems useful just to like stop this try abort thing or abort thing from blocking.
Wait,
So you suggest to rename to just abort?
Yeah, you can still return a bool. Like, I don't know. It seems more analogous to like if you're trying to throw this like asynchronous thing with as soon as you get back to runtime code.
Stefan, I think your comment about cancellation token, I think that was something other than what we were previously discussing. Are you suggesting that abort basically be void abort and it takes a cancellation token that is used to abort the abort?
I think it should be exactly like wait, but called abort. It should be like manual reset event slim.wait. It can return a bool saying like, okay, the code stopped before like the timeout.
Right. Well, I think you're making two comments. One is this isn't a try method because it's going to still do the operation even if it returns false. And then I think your second comment was about also passing a cancellation token to this to allow someone to force it to return earlier than it otherwise would have. Like instead of a raw timeout, have it be a caller-based cancellation thing. I'm curious. I mean, this is a super limited scenario API that we basically want no one to use unless they come, unless they've been pleading for it. Are they all satisfied with timeouts? Like, I don't want to make it user friendly, basically.
So for like we use timeout for debugger function evaluation and works fine for years. So I don't see a scenario when we need a like cancellation token here.
Yeah, I agree from the perspective of like the runtime internals themselves don't understand cancellation token. They just understand raw timeouts, which means that we would have to implement it over the top of this as a loop, basically, which keeps calling cancel over and over and over again.
Right. So then for implementation reasons and perf reasons and usability reasons and attractiveness reasons, we should just stick with timeout. But I agree with Stefan that it makes sense to remove the try from the beginning of the method name.
I
agree too.
have thought about that, and I don't like have strong opinions. So your argument makes sense to me. That we are still aborting, and try abort may be a bit misleading, because if it returns false, someone may assume it's not aborted, but it will be aborted just later.
What are the semantics of this? If you call run twice, is that a thing or that's not a thing?
So I made this single use. I put it in implementation details, not on my PR. So I made it single use because there is would be a race condition otherwise. So if you call run multiple times, and when you call try abort on another thread, when you don't know like which run to abort.
Yeah, that makes sense. For the second line of the comment, I was more wondering, once the action completes, can you call run again? Or just no, you just stick with this. Okay, I think that's fine. I just wanted to check.
Okay. I mean, if we wanted this to be usable, then we'd probably lift a bunch of stuff off of task, like being able to ask, "Is it still running?" I do have a scenario question of, so we have now the slimmed down abort, aka it says abort instead of try abort. What are you supposed to do when it returns false in your F# interactive? Like, you know that you couldn't interrupt the code, but what do you do now? You can't wait. You can't know if it's done. I mean, I guess you can, because whatever code you had after run will run.
Okay, so I should first would like to tell you that in for debugger function evaluation, there are two modes, safe mode and one is root mode. So in case of safe mode, it's going to you can catch the exception and finally blocks are executed. But in case of root mode, the thread will be terminated forcibly. So for this proposal, we implemented only safe mode. So if abort return false, when it would be I think user should be notified that script cannot be aborted, and process restart would be a better option in this case.
And it's not even that it couldn't be aborted, it's that it hasn't been aborted yet, right? It might still be aborted 5 minutes from now.
Yes.
Yeah, I added the comment note that false just means it was in an uninterruptible state. Like a loop inside a finally.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the abort completing just means that the abort has been dispatched, correct? The action could still be in the process of unwinding.
That's what the true or false would mean, I think.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that is, in fact, the semantic that you intended here.
Sorry, I maybe missed the beginning.
Yeah, go ahead.
It returns true if abort happened in the specified timeout. But
what's the definition of the abort happening though? Is any part of action still running if it returns true?
Exactly. Yes. So successful abort means the execution was unwound to controlled execution.run frame.
Okay, so the action is no longer running if abort returns true.
Right. Yep.
Okay, got it.
So basically, run is try, invoke the delegate, catch thread abort exception, set completed to set aborted to true, and then abort returns that field.
Almost like that, except that I used try finally instead of try page.
Sure.
So a bool returning method doesn't really make sense at that point, because if you look at the conversation that Jan and I had in the thread, it dovetails with what Jeremy asked earlier about how user-friendly do we want to make this type. And what Jan had said is we don't really need to make it user-friendly at all, because there's expected to be very tight cooperation between the thread which calls controlled execution.run and the thread which ultimately calls abort. Like, they're expected to put their own synchronization primitives on top of this. That said, like, abort returning true could very easily be implemented as the calling thread simply sets a flag once run returns, saying, yes, it completed one way or another. Like, so why do we need a bool returning method? Is it just for convenience?
Because it
Wait,
feels like
quick
public
question.
void abort no time span is equally as effective, because you can just you know when run finishes because you called run. Did the line of code after run happen? So
Like, unless abort is telling me something that I can't already discover on my own, like, unless the return value is telling me that, like, we don't need it.
Does it help you know like whether the interpreted command completed gracefully or actually was aborted?
I don't think so,
think
since run will throw an exception, a thread abort exception or not.
oh, I guess that, yeah. So if abort aborts, run throws the thread abort exception, right? You're not intercepting that one to set the state. I guess that's what this line in the comment is meaning.
Yeah, but it's actually maybe not only thread abort exception, as I discovered after writing this. So because their code can catch the exception and throw a different exception. So it can be pretty much any type of exception thrown at this point.
Well, and we're not making thread abort. I guess with this, are we making thread abort special again, where you can't catch and suppress it?
You can catch, but you cannot suppress it if action is running through this API.
Okay, so if you said like catch exception, log it, and not rethrow it, this system is going to understand that you went back into a non-finally state and is going to rethrow the exception.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we're not bringing back thread.reset abort.
Well,
That was a joke.
Actually, that's a very good question, and the answer is kind of, because this is exactly what the run method does. So it suppresses the abort request flag. It clears the flag. So it's kind
But
of.
it's a good point.
But code inside of the user's action, if it has a
Right.
catch block, it can't call thread.reset abort.
It cannot.
Yeah.
Correct.
I don't necessarily like
But
the
when I
idea
catch
of a
it
thread
from
abort
run.
leaking out of this method.
So
Like,
it's thrown from run, but it's then catchable in that context.
Pardon? It's like it's still catchable. You can catch the exception.
Sorry, it's like it won't re-raise it if I catch it from run.
Right. That's correct.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of that, because since the dawn of time, thread abort exception has been considered one of those like uncatchable exceptions that your code can't really handle gracefully. And I think it would be detrimental to our user base to suddenly start telling them, by the way, here's a scenario where you actually want to catch thread abort exception and then just follow it. We should consider normalizing it to something like operation canceled exception or something like that.
Yeah, so we had thoughts on this to introduce a special exception class like controlled execution exception or whatever. So yeah, it's possible option.
So is it bad if the user code just handles it?
Handles a thread abort exception?
Well, whatever the exception is that abort will throw here.
So this scenario where this API is going to be used, you run unknown user code, so you should be expected to like any exception to be thrown. So you still have like catch all exceptions.
Not necessarily. A lot of code, like special cases, certain categories of exceptions, execution engine exception, out of memory exception, thread abort exception, and they consider them fatal exceptions that can't be handled properly. Like we would suddenly be saying thread abort exception is now being moved out of this you can't handle it correctly category into something that we very specifically expect you to catch and handle. Like that to me is enough of a change where I think it would confuse people.
We also explicitly in the doc state that for .NET Core, we will never throw a thread abort exception, and that's been the case since like .NET Core 1.0. So reintroducing this may be confusing and otherwise painful for users. But especially given the 20 years of semantics.
But we do want an unsuppressible exception in the context of the action, right? Like it's just as soon as it propagates out of run that we want to do something different. Like,
yeah, that's my opinion.
Regardless of what the document said before.
Yes.
I'm sort of loath to make this suggestion because it's bordering on me trying to make this API more usable, and I don't want to do that. But you could imagine this whole API, like controlled execution being a static class with a single public static void run that just took an action and a cancellation token. And then when the cancellation token has cancellation requested, all that does is the equivalent of trigger the abort. There's no waiting for it. And then any thread abort exceptions that get triggered are caught and translated into throwing an operation canceled exception. That is a very simple API. It composes with cancellation token, and then it makes sense that the API would throw an operation canceled exception in response to cancellation being requested. It's just that we implement cancellation in a much more forceful manner and non-cooperative manner than we normally do.
I like that proposal personally.
Yeah, when people were mentioning cancellation token, that's what I was imagining as well.
The only thing I don't like about it is the cancellation token is very expressly a cooperative cancellation mechanism, and we would be saying, JK everyone, it's not.
No, you are cooperatively canceling the run. The run is uncooperatively canceling the action.
Right. So the run still may stick around for a long time even after cancellation is requested, because it's effectively waiting for the runtime to be able to successfully kill the invocation of the action.
Okay.
Again, the only thing I don't like about it is that it makes it clean, which normally is a good thing. But
we can make it unclean with the obsolete attribute or other things pushing users towards, you shouldn't be using this unless you really know what you're doing.
I mean, for the most part, we do this by namespaces, right?
Yeah, but there's an entire category of users that are like, I don't care that it's in compiler services.
Right, but I would argue those kind of users don't care whatever else we throw at them, right? They just climb over it.
Well, I'd say that even that this is something that's even more so than the standard type of things we put in runtime compiler services or other similar namespaces. This is something where like it's not just unsafe, it's also if you don't understand the semantics around it and what you're doing and blah 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 blah, then you're probably going to horribly mess up and corrupt things. It's kind of like suppressed GC transition in that regard, where it's in compiler services, but if you're using it and you didn't explicitly go read the docs and everything else, you're probably using it wrong.
I mean, I would imagine this would have to be documented as like under no circumstances ever is this call supported in a production application ever.
Unless that application is itself F# interactive.
But that's not a production.
Fair
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah, we'll want to plaster that all over the documentation.
Yeah.
And then, if you want to have an app context that says just make run throw, or just make run invoke action without doing any of the nonsense, then whatever. That's fine.
So this
I
whole
have
thing doesn't. Sorry, this whole thing doesn't start any threads, right? It's just all on the same thread, right?
Yes.
This is minor. I have an innate bad reaction to using obsolete just as a way of triggering a warning. I have a preference for an analyzer, but at the end of the day, it probably doesn't matter. So just wanted to register my concern and move on.
Are there project types or scenarios where we know ahead of time this simply won't work? ASP.NET, for instance.
I think it should work for all type of projects, but for core CLR, so it's not. We are not using this API for mono or native IoT.
Sure, that's fair. And we could put whatever attributes are needed on it to say like this is only supported on certain platforms. Like with this, I can't imagine this would work in WASM, for instance. Maybe it would.
So if these APIs don't work in mono, what's the behavior when you call them in mono?
PNSE.
Platform not supported exception.
I mean, if we
Or
do
just
that, we
ignore
should
the
at least
cancellation.
annotate the APIs as such.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's always a possibility that the cancellation just is ignored.
Yeah, I mean, there's you could make the argument to Stefan's point that on mono it just invokes the action and ignores the cancellation token. But I'm also happy with making this be as not user friendly as possible. So throwing PNSC seems totally fine.
Yeah, I don't know that we have a way of annotating doesn't work on mono.
We
I mean,
don't.
I know, Steve, you weren't a fan of an is supported property, but this would be the scenario for it. Does the current runtime does this even have a chance?
Yeah, but you can detect it yourself. Invoke the empty action and see if it threw PNSE. That's assuming it PNSEs.
I'm fine with that. I have no problem with it is supported. My primary objection was to an opt-out flag. I'm not a huge fan of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I also don't think we need an is supported. If you really need it, like, you can do what Jeremy said. And I really want to err on the side of making this as not usable as we can muster. We're doing this purely for, a number of people you can, or a number of consumers you can count on one hand that all understand the risks.
Sure. I mean, we would still need to, document this is how you detect it and support.
Why?
Because
I mean-
such tools may be running on mono.
I don't think
Yeah.
we go around. I don't know that we're good at going around and documenting this isn't supported on mono. I think, we do it after people file bugs, and maybe we can do it here because we know it won't work on mono because we're not going to write it. But I think that
But-
our general stance is PNSE can come out of anywhere because that's
It
reality.
can, but this is a special type just from the perspective of like we really expect you to have a deep understanding of the capabilities of this type and the dangers of it before you invoke it, which indicates to me at least like we should spend a little bit more time on docs form.
Yeah, because consider the case where F# Interactive or Jupyter Notebooks or something is running on mono, and so the host interactive container wants to determine, can I do any kind of controlled execution or not? In which case you want to have a check of, is controlled execution supported? If so, set it up. Otherwise, pessimize down to the worst case scenario you have today of just crashing the whole or safely terminating the whole thing when an exception's caught.
Yeah, I do like this whole one API thing. That does clean it up quite a bit more.
I also think it makes it less clear what it does, which I think will deter people from
Well, it
just using it.
also removes some of those questions of what happens if you call try abort multiple times, because cancellation token has its inbuilt one shot.
Yeah.
It removes what happens if you call run multiple times because it was static. If you call run multiple times, well, you had to do that one after another. So it invokes the action again because you gave it a new action.
Yeah, and if you need to know if the operation completed, just you like set up your own wait handle ahead of run and then pass it to whatever method's going to do the abort.
Right. So we still happy with compiler services, or should we move it to runtime?
I think we decided on runtime.
Yeah, I thought we decided that too, but was going to circle back and ask.
I mean, the general intent of compiler services is things that we expect the compiler to call, right? Which this wouldn't be. This is basically something we expose for, I don't know, interactive host or something, right? Which is not really the compiler.
Yeah. And so, Steve, for obsolete versus a custom analyzer, like, obsolete is definitely a thing that the compiler has built in. It's part of its standard analysis and build, and this, we basically want people to not use this type, and if they want to use it, they can suppress the code. Making an analyzer just to look for the usage of the type feels redundant. Like, obsolete is, we could also decide we think this is stupid and we rip it out again.
Yeah, it's just not obsolete. If it was, we wouldn't be adding it.
We have added obsolete APIs before. Like, we literally introduced obsolete APIs. It's very rare, but there is precedent. I think like we did one on WebSocket in 4.5. Like we obsoleted it and EB never did.
Was it the famous is the application targeting net 4.5 though?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, but that one we only added for ABI compatibility, right? I mean, this is I think different, right? This is an API that is not obsolete. We just don't want people to just willy-nilly call it.
And again, I don't have a super high care level. If it's a lot of extra work to do a different analyzer. If we really believe obsolete is appropriate for this, like fine. It's again, it's an API we really don't want people using. It just feels strange to me that something called obsolete is being used for something that's brand new.
Span is obsolete. Obsolete's how span is related to the compiler. This is special. Don't do things with it.
But that obsolete doesn't surface to users. You don't see that in the docs. You don't get an obsolete warning.
Sure, unless you're on an old compiler, or you are on some language that doesn't understand the attribute, or you are using reflection. It gets surfaced a million different ways. It's just not surfaced in normal C# code.
I mean, one way to think about obsolete is because we added the diagnostic ID property. It's basically for us a way to say if the compiler semantics around how obsolete APIs are being detected are sufficient, we don't have to write an analyzer. So in that case, you could say as long as we give it a custom diagnostic ID so it doesn't surface, and a custom message so it doesn't surface this API is obsolete, it surfaces with CA 4711 and says you should not use this API. The experience is probably the same as if we were written a custom analyzer.
Does a custom message completely replace any mention of obsolescence in the message?
I thought it did. I thought you override it entirely.
I believe it does because I was just testing that the other day. But remember, we also have the ability to display a URL, which can go to the documentation page for this and tell people like, hey, this is everything you need to know about when to use this, when not to use it, and how to be successful with it.
I guess at the end of the day, it just feels like we're being lazy, but that's fine. Like if it was just as easy to use something.
We're locking down soon.
Sure. And if that's the answer, then fine. it feels like if it was just as easy to add a non-obsolete analyzer as it was to add the obsolete attribute, I don't think we'd be having this discussion.
I would agree with that. I mean, arguably, it would be easy for us to add a framework to the ROS analyzers repo where you just derive from an analyzer that effectively has the obsolete semantics, and the only thing you have to pass in is a diagnostic ID. We could do this as a one-off at some point.
But I mean, if, we want to get this in for 7, like in the next week, so obsolete, I think it's fine. It's fine.
We can remove it in the future, right, and then fall back to a regular analyzer.
Yep.
Okay.
Should probably preserve the diagnostic ID, but yeah.
Yeah, so we're not closing the door on doing, the preferred thing in the future.
Yeah, the only thing I should say is let's make it clear in the obsolete attribute that we need to assign a custom ID. It should not surface with the generic obsolete one.
That's fine. We have processes for this. There was a question that was raised earlier about supported on and not supported on attributes. Do we need to do any type of annotation here?
I mean, one of the things that right now that it sounds like is unsupported on is a different runtime, and we don't have annotations for that. We could mark it as unsupported on browser if we assume that we're not going to write it into the WASM engine. I guess that's mono anyway. But again, I don't think we care about being nice to people in the development experience here. It's you call this and it shot you in the foot. Congratulations, that's what it's supposed to do. This is a foot gun. Let's stop trying to make it nice.
So about the obsolete IDs, I actually sent an email about this a month ago, but it didn't get any traction. I think you're on it, Emo, but we haven't been updating the AKMS links for the last 8 or so diagnostic IDs. I almost registered them myself. I sent an email asking if I should, but we should make sure that's happening.
Okay, yeah. But send that email and CC me because I registered most of the earlier ones.
I'll CC you right now.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So are we happy with this? Is it functional but unusable in the way that we would like?
We keep saying but unusable. That makes me sad.
I mean, I can make it more unusable. Call that.
Right.
So this run method would throw normalized operation cancellation exception, right? Or in case the execution was cancelled, what should it
Yeah, I think we translate a caught thread abort exception into an operation canceled exception.
Okay.
Yeah, and cancellation token has the register a callback on cancellation for, so then that would call the set thread abort state that you want, and then basically you would just catch thread abort exception and throw new operation canceled exception.
And presumably we could decide whether we want to store the caught exception as an inner exception or throw it away completely. I don't know if there's any usable information in that thread abort exception. Presumably we just ditch it.
Yeah.
Well, call stack may be usable to see where it's stuck.
Doesn't the runtime actually reuse thread abort, a singleton thread abort exception instance for all aborts? So the call stack could get ripped out from under you?
No, I think it creates a new one unless you are an out of memory situation.
Anyway, if the information is reliable, then we can capture it. By the way, we do have an API right now in .NET that allows you to set an arbitrary call stack in an exception instance. So we could still give you back the call stack, even if we don't give you back the original thread abort exception.
That's right. We could just copy it from one to the other.
Like, I think I would prefer that above returning the original instance, but weak preference.
Yeah,
I mean, that's fine.
Yeah, there's presumably we also want if they threw another exception out of a finally block and that's leaking up to here, we presumably also want that normalized to operation canceled exception, or do we not? Like, if the cancellation token was invoked, do we care that the exception is always OCE?
I don't think our other cancellation token accepting APIs do that.
Fair enough.
So what if user code catches thread abort exception and throws a different exception? Should we also discard that exception and normalize the operation exception?
Won't that get turned back into a thread abort exception by the runtime? Like, won't the runtime guarantee that any exception leaving the cache block will be thread abort exception?
No. So if you throw a different type, it will. There is can only one exception in the flight. So if you throw a different type, it will use it.
Okay, whatever. If you throw a different exception, then I'm fine with that exception propagating up, because after all, you threw it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right, and chat once again asked for an opt-in runtime switch, but I think we said no.
The invocation is the opt-in.
And I personally don't care if there's an app context switch that turns it off. So.
Yeah.
All right.
And Tom, are these changes workable for your scenarios? Like, do you foresee any problems with these changes?
I believe it. Yes, I believe it's workable. So
okay,
I think
awesome.
It was a very, very useful review and a lot of very valid arguments. So I have not talked about cancellation tokens before, so I need to check how it works. But other than that, everything is really valid arguments.
The only thing that might trip you up is the cancellation token cancellation token source cancel method. I believe is a blocking method. You'll just want to figure out how, if at all, you want that to block when someone calls it. And Steve Tobe can probably answer more questions offline about that.
Steve Tobe designed that whole system, so now you know who to bug.
Okay.
Feel free to thank me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Add wrap and unwrap methods to negotiate authentication. 70909er. You still with us, Tomas?
Yes, just being on mute. Sorry, guys. So this is continuation discussion we had about a couple of weeks ago, where we tried to create a negotiate interface to avoid reflection in ASP.NET and to provide enough API surface for HTTP client on Android. This is basically continuation to also provide services for code like SQL client, either to MySQL or MS SQL or Postgres, or possibly add enough surface for somebody to do SASL or other type of authentication beyond just the basic HTTP. So when you negotiate, not only you can pass in blobs here and there and wrap them in a text in HTTP headers, you can also negotiate privacy and basically encrypt the whole traffic. So the wrap and unwrap methods allows you to basically deal with the incoming blob and outgoing blobs to basically do the crypto parts and the crypto transformation as raw for somebody who's not HTTP. So we're basically proposing or to add 2 more methods for the class we approved last time. And the terminology wrap and unwrap comes from GSS API terminology. So we're basically mimicking that thing to take an input buffer and basically write out the blobs for somebody who's not HTTP.
I thought we weren't using iBuffer writer anywhere in the BCL.
So the original proposal didn't. We basically had a byte array, and David comment on it folder, and Philip Navarro did some prototyping, and he liked the API, so he basically turned it into the iBuffer writer, and it's. But again, the original proposal was have a buffer array which would always be allocated by the transformation. I don't know about the guidance.
We're using it in UTF-8 JSON writer, so we at least have one place.
Okay.
I would not do it, but again, Philip did prototyping and he said it works great, so I'm basically trusting his word. He has a PR open as a draft PR for basically implementing this whole thing. So again, I think similar to the previous discussion, it's not necessarily API meant for common developers. This is really for people who build frameworks or build services or libraries. So like the SQL client or Postgres or some other specialized libraries, not necessarily the end users or end applications.
Sure. I mean, yeah, if we think it's better to use it here than to have this, try wrap and wrap writing to a span and whatnot, then sure. I feel that generally we've written it out, but if we used it in UTF-8 JSON writer, then we've used it in the BCL. So
yeah, I kind of do wish we would use it in a few more places, honestly, and this seems like another toe we can dip in the water. And if we get feedback that it's difficult to use, then we could always add other outputs. We're not prohibiting ourselves from doing it. I don't think this adds any new package dependencies, because that's in the system.
Nope. So this is the first part. The second part, it's related to sort of details of authentication. So it allows request mutual authentication, and there are sections about impersonification. That's basically again exposing features functions which already exists in internals of negotiate stream, but it exposes them as APIs. So somebody who would like to implement something like negotiate stream can do that in their application. So again, just some little details to expose to get better control about how the authentication and the negotiation works. Hopefully, again, nothing really controversial here. And we already approved the client and server options, so it just adds a property into the options for both server and client.
I assume require mutual authentication is defaulting to false? And
I do
allowed impersonation level
I,
has some sensible default?
We can make sure they do.
Okay.
And I think the false would make sense to me.
In place should probably be a capital P.
That's
for
fine.
Unwrap in place. Anybody want to disagree with that?
Going back up to wrap for a second. You have a ref bool instead of an out bool. Is that ref an input and an output parameter?
Honestly,
Oh, thanks.
I don't know.
The
I can
dot
figure it
comment
out.
says it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
We don't tend to do that within BCL code. We do tend to use separate input and output parameters.
Yes, request encryption and out bool was encrypted or whatever.
Like if you request encryption, why would the output not be encrypted?
You said yes, but the protocol said I don't have any encryption.
Said
I'm just
no.
signing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you want to split them, I think it'll be fine.
Yeah, it is a weak preference, but I think generally BCL, we do tend to use different arguments for input and output rather than combine them into a single ref. The exception being things like monitor.enter, where we force you to pass a very specific value as the output.
Yeah, I think that'll be fine.
Okay, so request encryption and out is encrypted.
That sounds reasonable to me.
Okay. And those are all outs and not refs. Okay, and part 3.
So the extended policy was something, again, which the negotiate stream used. And I think it's mostly about the impersonification. And the last part was because we adding or exposing new functions, we would like to add 3 more status codes to the enum we approved last time. So at the bottom, we would have 3 more enums in a status code. So it's not new enum, it's addition to what we approved last time.
I mean, it feels like there's a slight disconnect between validation of target name failed and the word target unknown, but
We have better suggestion. I think it's we can update it. It's
yeah, I mean, it's probably fine.
yeah. I think some of those come from the GSS API, so I don't know if he's trying to mimic them exactly or if he's trying to make them sort of .NET friendly. I don't think it makes much difference. But so if there are suggestions, we can take them.
I just hear crickets. So
Yeah, I don't really have feedback on these 3 things. There is a single. I'm looking at the existing enum definition. There is a single success value. It looks like completed with value 0. Do you anticipate that will remain the only success code ever on this enum?
I think so. We even didn't have it originally, and then there was guidance that we should have value 0 default, and so we added 1 just kind of for the completeness. But I think yes, we expect there to be the only one success.
Okay. The reason I ask is because if you anticipate more in the future, you should start clustering these values so that success are all contained within the same range and failure are all contained within the same range.
Yeah. We could leave a gap, but again, I don't expect any at this point, so I don't know if it's worth it or not.
Totally fine.
All right. Any other feedback? I think
What's the final API shape that you now have? I think my only feedback would be I would remove the word code from the enum. Like there's nothing code about it anymore.
negotiate authentication status
it's not
code.
a protocol.
Yeah, we just call it negotiate authentication status. Because I mean, it's not a code anymore, right? Because it's an enum. You don't have to decode it. That's the whole point.
But it's not like mirroring an existing like status code from a protocol, correct? This is something that we just defined ourselves.
I think it mostly reflects the GSS API errors. And again, it's already the one we approved last time. We can still change it. That's not a problem if we choose to.
Yes, I went with the illegal syntax of partial enum to indicate that these are just being appended. This is an existing enum.
Oh, we already have that enum.
As of 7, but
yeah,
that is
as
a
of
previously
like 2
approved
weeks ago
name.
or 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, to me, code in enums feels odd, but that's all.
I mean, we have HTTP status code.
But it like protocols do refer to it as a status code though, so it does make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think in their case it makes sense because the status code is 404, right? So it is a code, right? I think the whole point is when you put it in an enum, it's like it's no longer a code because it actually is English text at that point. But
yeah. That's fair. I can see either way. My caring is low. And not renaming things is probably easier.
We can go with either one, whatever you guys choose to.
Noted.
I think one thing we could do is we can check if ASP.NET already consumed the first version. I don't think they did, but if they didn't, changing it would be cheap, sadly.
All right. Since I hear crickets, boom.
Thanks. And there was one more in the queue. I don't know if you guys can skip to it. Hopefully be easy and quick. And then I can go have a dinner with family. This is one I discussed with Jeremy before. And basically, when you create SSL stream, we do magic to do a certificate validation, but there is no way how the users can impact it in any fashion. And for example, we might download some artifacts, intermediate certificates, URLs, and whatnot, and there's no way how to control the operation. Only after all this is done, we invoke a delegate if provided. So basically, adding the X509 chain policy to SSL options allows users who do not want, for example, the artifact downloads to kick in, or they want to specify timeout or whatnot, to basically be in charge of creating the policy on their own. So the proposal is you would add a nullable reference to it. If it exists, we use it as it is. If it's not, we'll construct it behind the scenes from the pieces we know about, and we would use it. That's mostly it. I don't know if Jeremy has some more comments on that or insight.
I mean, they should be properties instead of fields, but one thing that we talked about in this is, and there's not a API shape change, so it's hard to write down, but we can discuss it here. X509 chain policy, when you construct it or you call the silly reset method that it has, the policy object sets the validation time to date time now, and we think this surprises everyone, or at least anyone who uses the policy twice. So we discussed changing the default to be either the property returns you whatever date time now is if you haven't set it every time you call it, or we change the default to a sentinel value like datetime.min value, and what that tells the chain API to do is use datetime.now when you do the validation, because it's a non-nullable value that's previously defaulted to the time of object creation, but most people don't even create it. They get the implicitly created one on X509 chain, build the chain, and then throw it away. It's only when like ASP.NET tried saving these policies so they weren't recreating them over and over and over and over again that they found that, you know, after a couple hours things would stop working, because they now said the certificate, we care if the certificate was valid, you know, 3 hours ago, not if it's valid now. And after a cert renewal, you'd start seeing weird things happen. And of course, if somebody sets it to an explicit time, we would say that that's now baked in because you called the setter. But basically, that adding a default or changing the default value to be either it reports datetime.min value, or we do foofy things in the property in the get. If the set was datetime min value, always returns datetime.now. So, does anybody want to opine on that aspect?
Where is this timeout set? Is it this datetime is set on the policy itself, or where does this guy come from?
Yes.
I mean, it does seem a bit like in the scenario here, the user would have to create that object, right? Or where would they get the chain policy from?
So they'd build it themselves. So basically, they'd build a one-time model of new X509 chain policy, and Tomas had some examples of like, because they want to set custom trust, and there's a whole lot of options we've added on SSL authentication options to try and build this for us, but every time we add a feature in X509, it takes a release and a half before SSL Stream catches up and adds the feature. So this just gets us out of that delay. And so it's, they built a thing, they set some custom policies, maybe they added some custom EKU validation that they want, and turn off downloads, and but the problem is when they constructed it, this verification time property got set to the time that they invoked the constructor. And the longer they keep reusing it, the less likely it is to be correct. Another alternative, because I discussed with Tomas that SSL Stream should be making a copy of this policy, just so we don't have the complications of delayed modification, is SSL Stream could just set verification time equal now every time before it calls it, but it really feels like we're working around bad design at that point.
I mean, is there any case where we care about the verification time being in the past?
SSL Stream always wants it to be as of the time, or should always want it to be as of the time in the past, or as of the time of the call. Again, maybe we would say that if we support the magic now value, that if a user sets the verification time, it's up to them to say they care if they talk to a server whose certificate was valid a week ago. That's a weird scenario, but whatever. It's not a thing they can do right now without getting the chain, changing the verification time, and re-invoking the chain build. But
normally we just make new properties rather than use Sentinel values, because people can misinterpret the Sentinel value, especially if you have old code.
So you think on X509 chain policy we would add verification time uses now as a Boolean and default that to true?
Something like that, yeah.
We also talk about adding a clone method. So for SSL Stream, you would clone it when we duplicate it, and that would reset the time. So there'd be specific clone method rather than overload on the property.
Yeah.
And if you have a choice, I would make it internal, but because it's in different namespace, we can easily make it internal.
The yeah, so the problem with a new property, if we were to add it, is if somebody sets verification time, we should change the new property to false, and we have a guy like because we're not going to use like if they set the verification time, we should respect it. And because if they're on old API, they can't clear the new flag, and we have a guideline that says changing one property should not impact another. So adding a new property feels like it's against design guidelines here.
Yeah, but there's other cases where we do that, right? Like if you have a get only full name property on customer, right? If you set first name or last name, it will change the full name. So I feel like we have done this before. I think I grant you it's a bit fishy, but I think it is the least impactful thing, and will probably have the right semantics in almost all the cases.
Yeah, and we should probably go ahead and add a clone method on the policy so that we don't have to make modifications to SSL streams clone every time we change the chain policy.
Yeah.
That would be nice. And you can recommend that cloning sets the time to now, unless it was set before. Right? That should work, Jeremy?
Well, I mean, I think cloning would copy everything over. So if you're in magical now mode, it will stay magical now mode, and if you're in explicit time mode, then it would be explicit time mode.
Yeah,
I imagine cloning would just call memberwise clone and return the new object. Done.
Yeah, we'll probably have a property called verification time ignored or something that just defaults to true. And then when you set verification time manually, then it sets that to false. Something like that. Have to be careful with how clone works, but yeah.
I mean, we could just document it's a shallow clone.
I would also feel that most people don't fiddle with the details, so so it's not necessarily we need to make it easy for a wide audience. This is mostly for users like Kestrel or again advanced users who need some special tricks for validation.
Right.
So I don't know if it's worth of adding new property, but certainly I'm not against it.
Yeah, I mean, the verification time field exists on the chain because, if you're doing something like Authenticode signing, what you ask is, as of the time that the Authenticode signature was generated, was that certificate valid? So you don't care, is it valid today? You care, was it valid in the past? But for SSL stream, it should always be now.
Right, but in that case, the time would be set, right, explicitly most likely, right? So the magic still should work, I think.
Yeah, now it's no longer a suffix, no, but yeah.
Yeah, and we can. Chat suggested I got rid of the is, and so, I mean we can verification time ignored.
Yeah, that'll work. I mean, I just realized one thing. Like my example earlier works with full name because full name is probably get only.
Mm-hmm.
Like where this type of fall apart is if you deserialize it, right? Because if you have some logic that just copies all the fields, now the order in which you assign will make a difference.
Yep.
Which, granted, is a problem.
Yeah, and that, with the Sentinel with date, time, min value, my logic there is certificates didn't exist in the year 0, so none of them should have been valid then.
Yeah. I mean, the Sentinel might be cleaner from that point of view, but it has other problems now, right? Because you now have a breaking change where, the time will differ, right? Depending on where you are at.
Right. And then the problem is, would we say that that's a storage decision? So if you call set time to min value, does get time give you min value, or does get time then just always return the call to datetime.now? I hadn't quite worked that one out in my head, but we can add the new property, and I really doubt anybody's like XML serializing these things because I don't think they'll rehydrate cleanly. So
Yeah. I mean, it's basically any other
659
code
chain
that you would
policy.
write on top that would initialize them by setting all properties would still break, probably, right?
Yeah,
But I
this,
guess if
this
it's manually
shouldn't.
coded out, it's fine.
Yeah, binary format or an XML serializer shouldn't try serializing this thing. You should be okay.
I mean, somebody could. It's just a basic type, but I don't know that the collection types will, because it's a bunch of custom collection types, and they probably won't rehydrate cleanly.
I'm just saying the types are not annotated in a way that our inbox serializers will attempt to serialize them.
No, I thought XML serializer would do anything you just throw at it.
It doesn't. I don't think it does internal and private fields by default. But I would check that.
Right, but this would be a public property.
Oh,
Yeah,
sure.
they're all public, right? So all the properties are get set public. So pretty
Fair
much
enough.
any
Don't do
serializer
that.
in the world will happily deserialize this type, assuming, of course, that the collection types can be deserialized.
Fair enough. I'm just more amused that we're apparently using local time for these properties.
Of course.
Yeah, I think it's because the Windows APIs take local time.
Oh boy.
We have to
Yeah.
change them into UTC to work with every other operating system, but I think we have to change it to local to work with Windows.
What does reset do?
Puts it in the state as if you'd called the constructor.
So that would mean reset would basically set verification time ignored to true now?
Yeah.
I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, but what it does for everything else is set them to their default values and nukes all the collections. And then, so this will just change back to its default value.
Nice.
Okay, so I think with the clone, so SSL stream, when if it receives one of these, it'll take a clone, and so we're detached from delayed modification, and in particular from concurrent modification, if SSL stream tries modifying it, and because there are some things it should do, and then yeah. We've talked about changing the default so SSL stream doesn't have to keep modifying it. And so I think we're good. Should we have an analyzer that makes fun of you if you try setting things redundantly? So,
How so?
specifically, if you've set an X509 chain policy, then now things like
Revocation.
yeah, the certificate revocation check mode is no longer respected because you built a policy. The policy has the mode built into it, and I feel like somewhere there's the don't do download, but that's probably on the client. Anyway, should we have an analyzer that says these are old properties? They've basically been, or don't set both validation policy and any of the policies that would have gone into building a custom policy? Or do we just let people figure out that if you've set both of them, one of them doesn't matter?
I mean, my own perspective is like anything that helps people write more correct code is goodness, right? As far as priority goes, it's probably pretty far down the list.
We also has a precedence that we edit the certificate context, which allows you to pass in a whole certificate chain, and in that case, the certificate will be ignored on the properties that setting just the certificate, it's very old since framework, whereas the certificate context, it's something we added, I think, in 5. So I would say for now, we might just document it as best as we can. We can always add the analyzer if we see misuse or confusion.
Okay. Any other feedback? Did I hit approve on that one? Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, guys.
All right. Add APIs to JSON contract customization. 71123.
Okay. So yes, in the contract customization API review, we've added like bunch of APIs which are necessary, and we found like we have some gaps, like we weren't sure like we were gonna make it basically in time. And some of those APIs are like most of those APIs are matching basically what we have with the attributes. So in example, like on serializing, on serialized, on deserialized. So this is matching certain metadata we keep inside of the JSON. Like when, in example, like the type is implementing a serializable, I believe, like one of those interfaces for the serialization. And yeah, IJSON on serializing basically, so it actually says in the comment. And other APIs we've found that we need is attribute provider. So we found like as we started writing more functional tests, we found out that whenever we try to write any modifier for the contract, we are actually missing attributes, and because of that, we now have to map name from the JSON to a field. So basically, we have to do our non-resolution, and if JSON serialization policy, like JSON naming policy is set, like now you have to know what that is, and you have to basically understand how to reverse that process, and which might not necessarily be straightforward. So we found that if we add attribute provider, which by default for the default JSON type info resolver would be basically member info, that would help users. And also like if users creates their own property, they can also set it to allow modifiers to work better with that basically. And also other stuff we've added is order. So the order for the properties is kind of, I mean, it's useful because by default the list of properties iList doesn't have a sort method, and there is nothing which accepts it. So basically, you have to now remove all items from the list and add it back if you want to sort it yourself with your own sorting method. So we found that if we provide the order, that makes it easier. Like I guess we can discuss that later if this is something we want or not. And also some of the properties are extension data, which is a bug basically for whatever's left. So basically, like if there are like some extra properties, and they are all put into the extension data property. There's only one extension data property per JSON type info. So we've also, in the comment, we've put that alternative proposal could be creating something along the lines of JSON extension data property on the JSON type info itself. That would be a nullable property. So that is the alternative proposal here, or we map it with the or we put the bool flag on the property info, and basically that would map into the attribute you put. So basically, if say someone created incorrectly type where they put two extension data attributes, and now you want to correct it, now you remove bool flag from one of them and you fix that scenario. Or there's in the other proposal you would get an exception. So that's the difference between those two.
Christoph, there's a question in chat. Would a custom attribute provider, would that make it possible for someone to remap old data contract attributes into the JSON attributes?
So actually, like if you scroll a bit down in the proposal, basically the answer is no, not down, not that much down. Just here. So this is basically, I think, the example what someone was asked. Like, is that answering the question? I guess. So basically, that you can do that data contract attribute yourself now this way.
Fair enough. So sounds like yes, Friedrich.
Yep. Are there any, like I'm gonna stop here. Like, are there any more questions for what we have now? Or
so on this one, we're only one thing on a type is allowed to be true, it does feel like it should be more just a nullable property on the type info to me.
Fair enough. So there is a proposal for the name, specific name somewhere in the bottom, I believe. Like it might be the last, literally the last, or one. Yeah, this one. So that's what it would look like. So that would match the name, except I dropped the JSON from the name. So that would be the proposal in that case.
Yeah, that seems better to me. It makes it much clearer that you can have zero or one of them.
I guess this is arguable. Like me and Eric discussed this a lot. I like this one better. Eric likes the other one better. Like both have some advantages and disadvantages, I guess. Like I guess Eric can probably defend the other one better. So I'm gonna let him speak now if he's there, hopefully.
Yeah, I guess one drawback with the nullable approach is that effectively, if we're looking at a case where a user has, well, a type author has accidentally applied the attribute in two properties, which would typically result in an exception, the contract model doesn't allow the user to undo this behavior. So, one of the goals of contract customization is that you're consuming a NuGet, for example, that defines a bunch of DTOs, but the attributes have been applied in a wrong or inconsistent way. And I guess one of the value propositions of contract customization is that users should be able to correct these bad attribute annotations. And we have actually received customer reports about this being an issue. Having just one means that we necessarily need to only record one attribute and not the other.
So, I mean, to be fair, you can create the type from the scratch anyway, always, even if it's incorrectly annotated. But yeah, like, I guess there are scenarios where that might make sense potentially, but like, I'm honestly not bought on that, but I believe that there might be issues like that. So
yeah, and the other thing is that this is an attribute applied on a property level, and in that sense, it only makes sense to attach it to the corresponding metadata type.
So, because from a generator perspective, you would have failed to generate if they specified two things. So this would just be if like you're building this tree using reflection, that now you have the problem of it's either going to do the last one wins or it threw an exception, but the whole point is you were trying to fix the model.
The idea is that when you generate things, you don't actually throw exceptions. The point of resolvers and modifiers acting on resolvers is that they act on mutable metadata, and there's a subsequent lock phase where everything is validated, and if you still have like two properties with a bool flag enabled, then it would throw an exception.
Fair enough. So yeah, I guess from that sense, I understand where the Boolean comes in, because you're just modeling, this is what they wrote in the attributes, and now you can fix it.
Yeah.
So it's a little sad that it's, garbage in, garbage out, but it sounds like that's kind of your goal.
I mean, there are some attributes, like if you put, you will get exception anyway. So like if you put like JSON converter attribute wrong and it has the wrong type, I believe we will also throw. Not in all cases, but like if you put that on the type, I believe that will throw unless you add the converter in the options yourself, which overrides that always. But yeah, like I don't have a super strong opinion on this. I'm gonna be like letting you choose, I guess, in this case. So the next API here on the list is get nullable converter. So this is in the editor browsable never class, and this is used by the source gen. So we currently have a get nullable converter method which takes JSON type info, but since the combination is now possible and combining the context is now possible, we cannot use the type info to create such converter because we need to always consult options to get the latest type info and get converter from there. So basically, in order to get the inner converter, we also always have to ask options. Hey, what is the converter? So that's why we need the new API here to generate the code correctly. Otherwise, that would not ever consult the options. It will always be hard coded. So basically, if you combined inner so an example, like if you created like a my class nullable, and you would generate code for that class, and now you would combine resolver which does something special for my class, we would still be using the old one because it wouldn't consult it. And like with this API, we can make that work.
I have a question for that method. Could the argument be a JSON converter of T instead of JSON serializer options? So in other words, could the source generator resolve the relevant converter from the options instance without needing to delegate that responsibility to JSON metadata services?
If I remember correctly, the answer would be no, because it always has to go through options anyway. And the options basically knows the best answer what the converter should be, and the like JSON serializer context is kind of a resolver on its own, and like basically it has also takes options as the argument at that point, and like it really has to consult the options to get the correct converter like anyway. So.
Right. I mean, these are APIs,
and also it's more consistent with other APIs on that same class. So like if you look at the other APIs on the JSON metadata services, almost all of them takes options except with this one.
Right.
And I mean all of them which has inner stuff.
I mean, for what it's worth, these are JSON metadata services is not meant for consumption by users. It's meant for consumption by SourceGen. So.
Yeah. And yeah, and the last API is basically JSON serializer options get type info, and basically the difference between JSON serializer and options dot type info dot get type info is like one of them is cached and one of them is not cached. So basically the options dot get type info would be kind of in pair with the get converter. So you ask the options, hey, what did you actually use? And versus like if you do options dot type info resolver dot get type info, that will always give you the new instance of JSON type info. So that, yeah, like basically I guess it's like kind of in pair with what get converter does.
And maybe to add to that, the motivation behind this method is that we have a bunch of serialize and deserialize overloads on the JSON serializer class that accept JSON type info of T as argument. These were originally designed for consumption by SourceGen, but it stands to reason that it should be possible to use these in the context of customized contracts in general. And using these APIs has theoretical benefits because you don't actually need to look up the contract every time you're serializing. You have it and you pass it and it just serializes. I think these are all the APIs, right?
Yep.
So the property info order property, you have it as non-nullable and defaulting to 0. Is that the correct way to represent it?
So that's what we currently do. If basically if you put attribute on half of the properties, they will default to 0 basically. And 0 means we use the stable sort. So whatever is on the list, like that order is preserved. So it also matches what the newtons of JSON is doing. So basically, if you put it on half of them, like on the half of the properties, then basically they will get sorted. That like if you don't put the attribute, it's sorted as if it was 0. Like we kind of wanted to preserve that behavior in here.
And I should point out that negative ordinals are also valid.
Yeah.
Which is unlike what system runtime serialization is doing.
Really, the question was would it be more accurate to show it as nullable? But if null is effectively 0, then 0 seems fine.
Yeah, like if you set it to null, then it becomes unclear, like basically where the nulls should go. Should they go below or above? Like so that they have to have some order by default. So we like 0 kind of makes sense, I guess. So.
Fair enough. And I guess in get nullable converter, you have the where t as a struct because this is only about actual nullable and not just nullable annotations.
Yeah, this is about nullable of t. Yeah.
Okay. And this is just the generator knows not to call it when it's a reference type.
Yep.
All right, I've run out of questions. Anybody else?
It seems like Levi has some questions about the.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out why there's an order property if you already have an ordered list of properties hanging off the type info.
That's a good question, actually. If you wanted to sort the I list of properties, you would need to. So the I list of properties is not settable. So you would basically need to clear the list and reinsert the properties in the order that you prefer. And we found that to be cumbersome in practice. So just assigning an ordinal to each of the properties without necessarily changing their order, that kind of made sense. Although if you prefer to just do what you propose, that also works, obviously. So in the end, the list of properties will be sorted primarily by the ordinal and secondarily by their existing order in the I list.
So you're telling me that order property is literally to work around the fact that we don't have a sort extension method hanging off of I list?
Essentially, yeah.
Should we just introduce such an extension method?
Well, it would,
because you're clearly not the only people who need it.
But I assume right now your generator isn't caring about order and it's writing them down in the order it sees them. So it would just match what the JSON property order says. Of like the first one says 97, the second one says 2, the third one says -4. Like,
yeah, from our perspective, you can go two ways. So either we pre-sort it when user is about to modify them, and then we preserve whatever order is on the I list, or we don't touch it and then let users modify the order property and then sort it after they are done. We have like that step when this thing becomes immutable, and that's where we would sort it. So we go like one way or another basically here. Orders arguably seems cleaner, like especially whenever people try to sort it, they frequently do something similar to what the data contribute does. So basically, with the example below, if you try to write that, you would have to. It becomes like really cumbersome. It becomes almost twice as long because you have to. No, maybe not twice, but like.
Yeah, and
it becomes really weird to write, and I think this is a second piece of code I've seen when someone actually tries to do that. So. Just makes sense to have it from my perspective, but I don't feel super strongly about it.
Yeah, I guess we kind of skipped introducing that in the first round, precisely because we felt that the list of properties was sufficient to convey this information, but it really is a convenience, because in most cases, what users want to do when they want to do this kind of thing is map some sort of ordinal out of an attribute and into the property, and just doing that by updating a value feels like the natural way to do it. And, you know, for what it's worth, JSON.NET has the same model.
Yeah, I guess the thing that's a sticking point for me is it's mixing concerns. Like the order is not, it might be specified on the property, but it's not a concern of the property. It's a concern of the containing type itself, which to me means that it should actually be specified solely by the ordered list of properties, because that's the thing that's actually on the type. That said, if you have like a clean way of, if this is the easiest way for people to use it, and you don't have to keep checking the order every single time you call it, then maybe that's okay.
I guess it's similar to the is extension data property versus being on the type info versus property info. So basically, like if someone put the order in not a way you expect it to, and you want to modify that, it's easier to swap the numbers rather than doing the sort. And the same goes for the extension data property, I guess. So like,
when is all of that ordering officially locked in and can no longer be changed?
So basically, there's a point when options and all of the JSON type infos become immutable. So that happens when the first serialization happens.
Okay, and all the property infos become immutable at that point as well, correct?
I mean, that's not 100% true because, but it's almost true. The reason why it's almost true is because, like, once you do the serialization and you haven't used specific type, we might still be constructing JSON type info, but like after the construction is finished, so basically whenever resolver returns the answer, that's when it's locked.
Right, so it sounds like you have a set point where the order is now fixed, and changes to the order property either can no longer be made or will no longer be respected.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
I guess
okay.
to convey what's actually happening, like as soon as you set the order and you lock the metadata, when you re-inspect the list of properties, they will appear sorted.
Yeah, and then, we can't add sort because the property is iList. So,
I mean, it would be an extension method, but yes.
Extension method on what? iList?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess we could make an
It wouldn't be
extension
in a
method for
JSON
iList,
package,
but
it would be somewhere else.
But
yeah.
that would be potentially horribly expensive because it would be a lot of removes and inserts versus internal sort, which could do its own thing.
I mean, in practice, everyone's going to pass an array or a list of key, and we would special case them just like all the other linked things do.
Yeah.
Well, this is get, so it's presumably some custom type of theirs that they're returning that they just said it's iList. So,
and for what it's worth, when implementing this, like we encountered a very clear lack of an in-place sorting solution for list of T or iList of T, and having such an API would be nice, actually.
List of T has sort, which is internal sort.
It's not stable.
But not stable sort.
Fair enough.
It's not stable, correct? Yeah.
But yeah, I think especially showing the usage here of you've run over it and changed data member attributes into copying up the order and like let that run once and then stable sort it when it's done, as opposed to doing a lot of inserts and removes. It makes sense to me.
Yeah, it greatly simplified that example because the example previously doing the same thing was kind of horrendous, actually.
Yeah, it was we basically had to construct our own list and sort it and then add it back, which was not ideal.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. So I think we discussed things and then approved it as is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Because I don't remember changing anything. So we discussed the order property and we discussed is extension data versus extension data property and left them both as proposed. So
I guess the only other question I have is we have properties that are delegates named on something as opposed to events. We still okay with that?
Well, the interface itself is called iJSON on serializing, so that's kind of matching that.
Okay.
But yeah, like we can discuss that, of course.
I mean, yeah, I feel like we've moved away from event, and we've said that in general we prefer a single delegate.
Okay. It's just the naming thing that's throwing me off here, but I can very easily see what Christoph just said, which is like, this isn't something that external people are meant to hook as a callback. It's something that you specify like the implementation of it. So a property, I guess, makes sense. Okay, great. We're all good.
All right.
Thank
Do we
you.
have any red items left that we feel we can talk about in approximately 10 minutes?
So
I think there was a
generic.
rename on there. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the generic math one has, it's 4 very small open questions that API review just needs to make a decision on, where the implementation had to differ from what we originally discussed, and we should determine, should we change the implementation to match what we had discussed, or should we keep it as is, basically.
All right. So 71648. Let's see how close to 10 minutes we can hit.
So the first one, we've got unary plus operators. We had originally said we want to make this a dim, but because the correct signature is you take in a T self and you return a T result, that is, C# actually allows you to define an operator like that. We can't actually make this have a dim. So the question is basically, should we correctly match the signature that IL allows? And users will just have to provide an implementation every time, and the implementation is trivial for them to provide. Or should we say, we don't care if someone is doing something, technically allowed. Unary plus should always be a effectively identity operation, and therefore we should remove the T result generic parameter and provide a dim. Today we're doing the match what IL actually allows, don't limit users or conceptual scenarios, and users will have to provide an implementation that just returns the identity in the 99% case.
Do we know of anywhere that has a semi-legitimate scenario for having T result be different?
I don't know of any 4+.
What about negation?
For negation, there are theoretically places that could go from an unsigned type to a signed type for negation.
Makes me wonder if we should have plus take both the T self and the T result just for symmetry there.
Well, that's what we have.
Yeah. Like stick with it and remove the dim, like Tanner was suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the cost or the question there is, do we care more about matching a theoretical need with the interface that we've never seen in practice versus that everybody who uses this has to go define the operator themselves?
Yeah, and it's more of a the scenarios around it gets more clear in the next question, which is actually a related question. But it ends up being if you're in a language or scenario where it is required, do we want to have it so that it's restricting them? And so it's basically a trade-off of do we theoretically restrict, or do we provide a convenience for a one-liner that can be trivially implemented? I-comparison and I-equality operators are basically the same scenario, where it's actually the inverse, where today we're hard coding to bool, but returning a T result is allowed in both IL and C#. This one actually has legitimate scenarios in that there are existing libraries out there that, for example, with vector types, they have their comparisons return a vector type rather than a bool, because that is the more intuitive thing for vector types to do. We had discussed that for our own vector types and said for consistency we don't want to do that. Users have to use explicit static methods to get a vector type instead. But there are user libraries out there that do comparisons and return vector types instead. And so this one has a legitimate user scenario for change the signature to not require bool and to return the T result instead. And then our number type and our own types will just return bool. And so there are two kind of related scenarios of, should we be consistent or should we basically enforce the framework design guidelines here?
I'm still wrapping my mind around like what the two alternatives are here.
Oh, it's, yeah. In this case, it doesn't look like it's negating dims. It's just, do we change I number to say that it's I comparison operators of T self T other bool, or do we just say bool is hard coded, which is what we currently did?
Yeah. My own leaning here is that we should not have the dim on unary plus, and we should make comparison operators take a T result so that we don't limit user scenarios where they do actually have this, and for overall consistency with what IL defines. We shouldn't opinionate these primitive building blocks, even if our guidance on using them is itself opinionated.
Well, I mean, for one, the guidance doesn't imagine that you're doing anything like a vector. It was just thinking in terms of a number, I assume. Certainly when I did the updates, it said you should maintain the, like, less than or equal should behave like less than or equals. Don't abuse arrow shape operators.
Yeah.
It is still doing that. It's just returning a lot of values instead of one.
Yeah.
Because you're doing parallel comparisons.
Right.
So it, yeah. I think if we had duck typing for static interfaces, then I would say the people who want to use this generically can define their own, but given that we don't, it probably makes sense just to shove this in using IL's expressibility, and then when we get to our higher level types that are representing scalar values, that we just lock it to bool there.
Right. I number itself would lock it to bool.
That seems reasonable.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question is, so we're exposing I-trigonometric functions, and this is generally good and correct, but there's kind of two open questions on it. So the first issue is that we're exposing atan2 and atan2 pi on this. This is correct in the sense that they're trigonometric functions, but it's limiting in the fact that they are invalid for complex numbers. A complex atan2 over a complex is actually y is the imaginary part and x is the real part. And so you wouldn't take in two complex values, you'd take in a single one. And so the suggestion for that is we remove atan2 and atan2 pi from I-trigonometric functions and only put it on IEEE floating point IEEE 754. That way it's differentiated between a general trigonometric function and a scalar specific trigonometric function.
I've never called them, so I don't care.
And then the other bit is we expose sine cos, but we missed that we should also be exposing sine cos pi, which allows you to get both the sine and cosine of x times pi in a single operation, which is more efficient than calling them independently.
Sure. I mean, looks like it mirrors. We have sine and cosine, and then we have sine cos, and we have cosine and pi and sine pi. So having sine cos pi seems reasonable to me.
Yeah.
Regarding that first paragraph, Tanner, say that I did want to call arctangent over a complex number. is the idea that that's not representable using the generic math, and I just have to call the static method directly on the type?
Complex is something like where, like vector, we will probably look at and potentially design an iComplex interface to more concretely allow users to represent complex values. For complex in particular, there's been requests that we support more than just complex of double for perf or accuracy reasons. And so something that's been in the back of my mind, but there isn't a proposal for, and which is out of scope for .NET 7 and maybe even .NET 8, is that there would be a iComplex of T self T scalar and a corresponding complex of T where T is constrained to I floating point. And then that would itself, iComplex, would expose a correct atan 2 pi and atan 2.
Okay, yeah. So I would be a fan of moving those onto the IEEE floating point interface then.
Yep. And then the next one is, so for iRoot functions, we expose root, which takes an integral in. And for iPower functions, we only expose pow that takes in 2t self. The former matches the IEEE expectations, where you can compute an integral root. So you couldn't compute like the root of you couldn't compute a root of 3.3. It's only the cube root, so only integral roots. But for power, IEEE actually has an optimization here where they expose a function called pow in, where in is restricted to only being an integral type. It is a very powerful and performance-oriented optimization because you can simplify the overall processing. While we don't necessarily have to expose that here, there is a versioning concern in that exposing a pow t self int y in the future might be problematic due to overload resolution. And so it would be good for us to decide if we should expose it today, and if not, if we think an alternative name like pow in or integral pow or something in the future would be reasonable versioning wise. Because if we do decide to go with an alternative name, then it may be worth considering renaming root as well, since it explicitly takes an integral today.
I was typing up what we were talking about so far, so hopefully somebody was listening to that.
I think we were all listening, we just don't understand.
Right. So this is basically the versioning concern around why we couldn't expose float APIs en masse.
Okay.
Due to how overload resolution works. If you take in so if you pass in something like an integral value, then that will implicitly upcast to float rather than double. In the same way, if in the future we decided exposing pow in with whatever name we decided was good, because it's a very useful performance-oriented optimization for the common use case of pow, then we wouldn't be able to expose it as pow t self int y, because it could conflict with pow t self t self. And so we should either make the decision of let's go ahead and expose pow t self int y today, and we can just have it forward as the simple implementation to make sure it meets the cutoff, and then we can optimize it in .NET 8. Or we should decide we're okay with coming up with some alternative name in the future for such an integral pow. Such as just mirroring the C name and the IEEE name of pow n.
So pow in is basically pow int just without the t. Sounds like.
Right. The in
Oh,
basically
n.
n.
Okay, got it.
Where in stands for integral. Like the C name is literally POWN.
Yes.
Pwn.
And correspondingly,
yes.
root is actually it's root in, and compound is compound in, because they explicitly take an integral type rather than a floating point type as the base, for lack of another word.
I do like the idea of having a separate method group, so a different name that is these fast accelerators.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you said, it more closely matches what people coming from other frameworks expect, but I guess that's the thing that kind of pushes me toward it.
Right. And so the most logical name to me would be, we kind of do what we've done with the other math APIs and semi-closely match the C name. And so it would just be root in, compound in, and pow in if we exposed pow in the future. And the in would likely be lowercase rather than uppercase.
I think it would be uppercase.
We've done other odd things with the APIs to match the C naming. Like ACOS is a capital A lower C, not capital C.
Yeah, but I really feel that where they're writing in all lowercase and they did pow and then pow in, like you have to figure out that pow and pwn are related, and I think that we would want pow and pow capital N where it's giving you a tokenization help on reading it.
That's fair.
So for root functions, are we renaming the existing root to root in?
That would be my recommendation if we're saying we should have a separate method group there to avoid the ambiguities.
Yeah. Tanner, remind me, we didn't introduce any new public static methods for pow and root, correct? We're just using the existing ones?
So POW doesn't have any new ones. Root was an approved but not yet implemented API that was implemented as part of .NET 7.
But I mean, did we expose it as a static member, not going through the interface on any types, or do we have plans to do so?
It's exposed on float and double and half.
Okay, so for those, for the overloads that take int, would you rename those to have an n suffix as well, or would you keep those as just power root?
Right, because they're new APIs that, and so there's no versioning concern if we go ahead and change that now.
Okay.
So does this problem then solve the default implementation problem?
Sorry, which default implementation problem?
Like, I think you mentioned at some point to me that there is an issue where we can't expose certain things as DIMs. But this is unrelated to this?
Yeah, that's unrelated to this. That's the next, that's the final topic here, which is the math constant access one.
Okay. So are there any other modifications to the power and root functions?
No, it's just change root to root in, and it's up to API review whether or not we simultaneously expose POW in as part of .NET 7 or not. I don't have a preference. We can always expose it as a DIM in .NET 8.
By just calling convertedness?
Yeah, it would convert from the integer to t-self.
Yeah, I guess any of the ones that we think we can add as a dim, we can delay, but any of the ones, like if we think that adding a root that's not root in is important, it feels like that needs to be added now, or could that be dimmed?
That could be dimmed with the annotation that it could potentially be a lossy dim, and it may therefore want a corresponding property to indicate whether or not it's lossy or not. But the IEEE standard nor C nor C++ define a root that takes a non-integral n. So I don't see a huge need for us to provide it.
Okay, so C has root in, but not root.
Correct.
Okay, then
Is
sure.
it a breaking change for us to introduce a default implementation in the future to an existing method?
It shouldn't be. It's only breaking if we implement it on a different interface than define the method.
Because of some weird vtable dispatch stuff.
Diamonds.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. The last one here is one that I don't strictly think we need to take. It's more of a here's an FYI. So these iFunction interfaces, there are concepts like cause pi, where they theoretically, to have a default implementation, need access to pi. Due to how C# works today, there is no way to do something like an if t is ifloating point IEEE 754 check and then get access to t pi. And so therefore it may be desirable for us to define an interface called iMath constants, or better name, that exposes e pi and tau, rather than only having them available on ifloating point IEEE 754. Theoretically, that could be versioned in the future to also include other constants like mini C implementations defined. But that's not part of this proposal nor a consideration for anything other than future.
See, this is an interesting versioning problem to me, because how do we add new constants?
So you would constrain, I actually made a typo there. So T self should be where T self is iMath constants and iNumber base. And then you would return an approximation of new constants using T self create and the double value, or the decimal value even.
I see. So we're assuming that anything can be approximated from a double or decimal.
Right. Decimal giving you 28 significant digits, and double giving you larger values, but with binary accuracy rather than something else. Likewise, you could actually do something like, in the worst case, you could make it always compliant by doing tself.parse and then passing in the literal string, which would be inefficient but accurate.
Yes.
Let
me know how it goes passing in the literal string that is pi.
Yeah, so the ifloating point IEEE 754 loses those constants and says that it extends iMath constant of something?
Of T self, yes.
Oh, okay, it's a T self.
Yeah.
I guess that makes sense.
And we would only do this, it sounds like, ourselves on the floating points, correct? Like, we're not suddenly going to make int 32 and iMath constants and then have everything approximate to 0.
Correct, because these math constants don't make sense for integral types.
Yeah, because I'm looking at that, I'm like, well, that's, irrational, that's irrational.
Yeah, I mean, should we, instead of math constants, should we call them floating point constants?
Yeah, maybe. The only potential concern is we would make a decision on, does decimal expose these or not? So far we've said decimal doesn't get any of these kinds of operations, because even though it's floating point, it's more a currency type, and concepts like pi, e, tau don't make sense, nor do functions like square root. And so we've historically not exposed them on that. And so I think we'd say it's ifloating point doesn't implement it, but ifloating point IEEE 754 does.
Yeah.
And that's why I chose iMath instead of ifloating point. And I didn't want to use ifloating point IEEE because these aren't specifically IEEE constants. They're a bit more broad than that.
Okay, that makes sense.
But ifloating point constants is kind of the next most logical name. And it's not the end of the world if we say that they're accessible to decimal, but only in generic contexts.
Chat suggests irrational constants. Would we have any rationals that we would add here?
Theoretically, we could. The intent of these constants is to represent values that are mathematically relevant, but which may not, where the intuitive representation may not be the most accurate representation. Like, for example, double as a pi is not the infinitely precise pi. It's an approximation that's off by an order of magnitude.
Right, but it, going with the irrational constants of, is there anything, if there's a rational value that we would add to here, then we shouldn't call it irrational, but if the only reason we would have to add any of these by name is because they're irrational and it's the give me your best approximation of it, then that name would make sense and would avoid your concern about floating point constants not being implemented by floating point.
Right. Most of these, I think, are irrational, but I couldn't guarantee that they will always all be irrational.
Yeah, there's also seemingly some type of terms being conflated where irrational doesn't mean can't be represented exactly. You could imagine that we have a numeric type, which is base E for whatever reason, and E would have the equivalent of the identity value in that system. So it can be, in air quotes, accurately, as in losslessly represented.
Fair enough.
Yeah. I think maybe the most intuitive thing here would be floating point constants, have floating point implement it, and have decimal only expose them explicitly, since you can represent 3.14159 blah 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 m as a decimal.
So you want it on floating point, not on floating point IEEE 754.
I think that's maybe the simplest and resolves the naming issue. And then we just say decimal doesn't directly expose these. It only exposes them in a generic context. And that's all of the topics.
Okay. Well, there was something on functions that I didn't, because you have functions and constants. So what was in functions?
So it's saying that in particular, trigonometric functions would then be constrained to it would be constrained to floating point constants. It would constrain itself to floating point floating point of T self rather than number base of T self. So we'd say that trigonometric functions are only applicable to floating point types where these constants are available. Or we say number base plus floating point constants. Either one of those works depending on if we want to be extra restrictive or not. And I'd lean towards be extra restrictive. Power is the only one that wouldn't have it because power works for integral types like big int, for example.
All right, you lost me. What word am I typing here?
So we have two options. We can either do number base of T self plus floating point constants of T self, or we can say it's floating point of T self. And I'd lean towards so I'd personally lean towards the latter, but the former is slightly more flexible.
Well, then we'll pretend you proposed it this way and that none of us cared.
I too think it should be called floating point.
Yep. Let's float those points. All right. So I manually stuck in sine pi and cos pi, sine cos pi, which only gets one pi in the name, but then both, let's call them properties, get the pi on the on the names.
Yep, that makes sense to me.
Okay.
And that's all the open questions for generic math. I think with this will be fully stable and in a reasonable world. At least for the people who are happy with the feature. There's still some people that are like, you're doing math wrong. They want monoids.
All right. So, the notes I have for unary plus, keep t result and kill the dim. Comparison and quality, add t result, and at I number, we'll lock that to bool, or I number base, or wherever the right answer is. At trigonometric functions, we moved atan2 and atan2 pi down to IEEE 754, and we added sine cos pi. We renamed root to root in with a capital N because of pwn. And then math constants, we went with I floating point constants. And even though it could also apply to fixed point and base E and other things, it matches the words we're using elsewhere in the system best.
Yes, and in particular, I have a long explanation of why floating point values are actually rational numbers. And so I floating point is technically equivalent to an irrational, but not exposing a numerator denominator directly.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone ever wants to understand that weird, the weird reasoning why.
The comparison and equality operators, I think you had mentioned this previously, but remind me, the reason that we're not dimming like not equals is for things like nan. Is that correct?
Right.
Because like nan doesn't equal nan.
Right. There's potentially edge cases where equals and not equals are not necessarily always pure inverses of each other. And it gets weird with nans because nan is false for all of them.
Okay. Are we being consistent across our entire API surface where we say like, well, because they're edge cases, we're not giving you a dim for these other APIs? Or a dim.
For the most part, the checked operators are the exception where we always dim the checked implementation and expect users to provide their own checked if that's desirable to them.
But we have a pattern we're following that you're satisfied with.
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure there was consistency there because looking at those, I'm like, huh, okay.
Right, because I mean, you could argue that 99% of types you could get away with defining, for example, less than and equal, and the rest of these could be written in terms of those. But
yeah. But as long as we just have a pattern that we're sticking to.
All right. And you were off by about 15 minutes in your estimate, Tanner.
Well, I estimated originally, like last week, it would take like 20 minutes to review, so I think I'm only off by 5.
I asked what can be done in 10, and you nominated this one.
Yes, people ask too many questions.
How dare we in an API review?
Yeah, how dare we
Yeah,
review
how dare
things?
we ask questions?
And then I have to write them down.
Well, I appreciate your answers, though. They were very thoughtful. Thank you.
And I'm glad we got this reviewed since I need it in by Tuesday anyways, and this is a pretty core feature to 7.
All right.
Also, to Steve's point in chat, we do need a non-trimmable version of this called iBloating point.
It's called turning 40.
Excellent.
Or, 35, somewhere around there.
All right.
Okay, so we have fewer red things, and most of the red things are hoping to be done and checked in by 5 o'clock Redmond time on Tuesday. So it'll be exciting to see how much we get through on our Tuesday 10 to 12 meeting, Redmond time. So, yeah, with that, we are over time, and I am hungry. So, everyone who wishes to join us again, see you at our same .NET time on our same .NET channel on Tuesday. Auf Wiedersehen.